tell everybody a little bit about where things got rolling for yourself and how you got into wrestling in Japan.
So first and foremost, my dad wrestled for a living. He was a professional wrestler from the 50s and wrestled up in New York, had a bunch of different names at the time. First he went as a German, as Otto von Krupp. Well, he had a couple different names, but then eventually became Otto von Krupp. He was about 5'10", 265. He was a beast, and he was wrestling New York. So I remember being in the old garden in the dressing room with my dad. And, you had Bruno Sammartino, you had Bobo Brazil, Wahoo was coming in and out. He had I'm not sure if he already had left the Jets. I think so. Just this amazing roster of old timers who everybody else stands on the backs of, right? So just by the sheer nature of having your dad in the business and all the people around you are in the business, because my dad really didn't surround himself with too many other people outside of those who wrestled for a living. By default, I got into the business. The great thing about my dad, though, was my dad never pushed anything. He said, I'll make things available to you. I'll help you get where you need to get, but that's up to you to decide if you want it. And so that was one of the really good things about him. And one of the things he did at the time was he looked at me when I was training with Masao Hattori. I don't know if you're familiar with Masao, but, has had his own career in different places. And Carl Gotch was coming in from Hawaii. He was going to domicile in Tampa at the time. He was moving to Tampa. And then my dad looked at me and said, if you want, I can talk to Carl and see if Carl will help train you. And so I said, of course, because Carl Gotch was Carl Gotch. He was a god of wrestling before he was designated as a god of wrestling in Japan. Mm-hmm. And so I started with Carl. I think it was 69 at the time, so a few years ago. And, the rest is sort of history. Eventually I, working on my mat game and becoming somewhat proficient in submission style wrestling. Carl was doing some stuff in Japan at the time. He obviously invited me because, I was one of his guys, and I started in Japan that way, and then eventually moved around, took on more of the pro stuff, ended up with Giant Obaba, who was just a phenomenal promoter in person, and kind of set my career. The thing about me, though, and this is why a lot of people don't know me from Adam, although I have recognition because of my brother. I had an abbreviated career and pretty much just stuck to Japan. I had other things going on here in the States. So besides wrestling, which was just a part of my life, once I made it into Japan, I just stayed there. I loved it. I got to wrestle everybody who was anybody because they all went there. So it's not like I was missing out on wrestling the premier talent here in the States because they all ended up in Japan at some point. And then I would come back here and I'd work for a living.